Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's seminar. We are honored to have our own Dr. Juliet Kinney today. Dr. Juliet Kinney is a Multibeam mapping and data research analyst at the center. That's the Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping and Geographic Center. And she is also a data manager for the Seabed 2030 North Pacific Regional Data Center. She's interested in paleoclimate, paleoceanography, and ocean atmospheric spatial temporal patterns and high-resolution seafloor mapping. Juliet was a hydrographic analyst with ERT and NOAA's Office of Coast Survey at GEBCO, CCOM, first as team lead with NOAA's Sandy IOCM, Center focusing on research to operations and how to use data collected for other purposes and bring data collection and management best practices into action in different groups. Then spent 2 years with National Bathymetric Source Project. She received her PhD in Marine and Atmospheric Sciences from Stony Brook University, where she worked with Professor Roger D. Flood. Her dissertation, The Evolution of Peconic Estuary, Oyster Terrain, Long Island, New York, focused on 3D high-resolution morphology data and geochemical analysis of stable and radiogenic isotopes to guide the interpretation of sediment samples from the paleo environment. She was a faculty member in the Department of Geological Sciences at Bridgewater State University and USGS intern in physical oceanographic and sediment transport, and graduated with a BS in Earth Sciences, Earth System Science from UMass Ames. Please join me in welcoming Juliet.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about the North Pacific Data Center and what we've been doing past year, but also a little more than that, because I realize a lot of you here don't know what we've been doing. So, and to try to put that in perspective, I'm going to try to focus on the collaborations that help us build better ocean maps. And my perspective here is very focused on that data management, coordination, and best practices, and how do we get more data and more data, right? You have to have all those other things in order to make that work, right? So, okay. Outline what I'm going to talk about. What is Seabed 2030? What is the GEBCO grid? All this data we've been getting and ingesting into the grid. What are some of these other global initiatives? And how do we kind of break this effort up into smaller pieces and think about it? So, I made this little octagon pattern over the map to kind of signify this concept of breaking things up into smaller pieces. So Nippon Foundation, GEBCO Seabed 2030 project. This goal is to inspire everyone to share data, go out and map more, and actually try to get the world mapped by 2030. Started a project, it was around 5% globally mapped. And Seabed 2030 team is here to try and compile the GEBCO map. Produce editions every year. We've got a whole bunch of people here that are GEBCO scholars, so they know it, hopefully know what GEBCO is, but there's a whole bunch of other people in the room that I know are not ocean mappers. They probably don't know what GEBCO is. So it's the general bathymetric chart of the oceans, established in 1903 by Prince Albert of Monaco. Ooh. This makes it sound so fancy. But it's a joint program under the IHO, the International Hydrographic Organization, and the IOC, Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. So it's got these big, broad intergovernmental oceanographic organizations that say, yes, this is an awesome project. We want you guys in different countries to coordinate, and scientists all over the world to come and volunteer and help make this happen. So mainly volunteer kind of makes this happen. So this is, yay, our 2025 GEBCO grid. This is a continuous grid, and this version is showing, where black shows where we don't have modern direct measurements. So a lot of you here know what that means, but I'll get to that more in a minute. So, all right, so here at CCOM, we have the North Pacific Data Center, and we cover this portion of the world's oceans. We are a joint center with the Arctic Center, which is centered in Stockholm, and they covers this part. Michael, Paul, Larry, together on this, and we collaborate with the folks in Sweden. And then we've got a whole bunch of other people here that we've been fortunate to have helping at different points on this project. So Bahima just left on to go on. She's, I believe, on an ex-ocean cruise right now, having us back in Panama for now. He had a brief little intern over the summer, the first time, an undergrad intern, and Sarah Kritikos, and of course Michael. And then we've also been lucky to have a whole bunch of GEBCO scholars do lab visits with us and help do mini projects. So I'll try to mention some of these mini projects later, what they've gotten to do. I talked about how we're joint centers with Arctic. So one of the things we do get involved with is, under their leadership, helping them provide data to create the IDCAP. So this is the map of the Arctic Ocean. So same data is going in there, but it's got a slightly different process to generate that. If you want to go and see that, that's available last year. Came out, publication in very, very end of December. What's happened under Seabed 2030? So this is 2014, before the project started. And now, showing this in black where we don't have direct measurements to direct measurements for the most recent grid. You can see substantial progress. It went from about approximately 6% in 2017 to 27.6% is the calculation from November 1st. It's a lot of mapping. It's not 100%, but getting there. So if you guys want to go and play with these maps pretty easily, I suggest you go to the GIS CCOM-UNH.edu site that Paul puts a lot of time and effort into uploading all these things. So people can interact with. You can use a little slider gizmo and see for yourself what's been mapped and unmapped. And this is what our region looks like in the most recent compilation. So this is what we then send to the global center, and it gets merged with all the other regional data centers together. This is our direct measurement layer. Another view. It's kind of hard to see in this view, but in the pink I try to show where there is substantial new data coming through. It's a little misleading in here because I put a continuous grid in. It's interpolated, it's kind of hiding the new multibeam that we got in this area this last year. And so now I'm going to try to describe this thing that's called TID. So this is one of the main products that comes with each GEBCO grid. You get a bathymetry continuous surface, and you get this thing called TID. TID means type identifier. So it's basically the technique of the data source of how it was generated. In this map I made number 10 yellow, that's single beam. Number 11 is multi-beam, so you can see we actually have substantial multi-beam coverage. It's counted in the statistics for this area. We get a little bit of satellite-derived bathymetry that made it map this for 2025. We do include some interpolation we do here that's just direct interpolation of data points to make a smoother surface in some places. And then you'll see some places up here, there's this red one, which is very confusing. And then what goes in between that is directly SRTM plus, but the red is showing where we've tried to bring through the direct measurements that have been constraining this SRTM plus grid. And so we don't write over them where we don't want to. So we try to interpolate. So everyone asks me then, what is SRTM plus that you're putting in the GEBCO grid under your direct measurements? And again, you just described this 44, these measurements you took out. So it's they did their direct observations and they put them in a 400 meter grid, and they used those points to help constrain the gravity calculations of water depth. So, and you're like, well, that was still kind of confusing, right? What is SRTM plus? Okay, you grab data out of it. That makes sense, I hope. The continuous grid of topography and bathymetry that is generated by the SRTM 15 plus. We're past this version, but this is the one that is a nice, lovely paper describing all the methods. Gets put in underneath all the data centers data. Look beautiful, looks lovely. Then you're like, okay, what is that? What is that acronym for? Why is she saying that? So the topography in this is generated from the shuttle radar topography mission that occurred in February 2000, and that was flown for the Space Shuttle Endeavour, which no longer goes up into space anymore, but that's when it was collected. And it was super high resolution and kind of really revolutionized high resolution maps of topography of the planet at that point. And that is the base for these lovely high resolution topography maps for the global extent. The other part, the plus part, is the bathymetry that gets added in, and that's derived from satellite measurements. So it's the satellite altimetry, and then from that they calculate a gravity field and try to figure out water depth. So if you want to go more and then follow what the group out of Scripps that really develops this and how they keep on modifying and try to push that. There's some sites. All right, so now I've talked about that and why we're filling in the ocean with that gravity map underneath. Gravity derived bathymetry, I should say. So who uses this grid now that we've got this? So I tried to go through about a year and a half ago and see if I could like look and find some metrics on who actually uses the GEBCO grid. I thought, okay, let's see if I can do like a citation search, journal search, see how many people use it. And it was actually kind of cool to see how quickly in the literature the current year's grid gets used and cited in the literature pretty fast. That was actually, I thought, really neat to see. Quite a variety of topics. And I really wanted to see if anybody was using DOI. The giant platforms that help you show you cited your papers are really bad at tracking DOIs. I was like, maybe I can track who cited what data source and do this, but like nobody's using DOIs enough. So that didn't really work. But since I know a lot about where data is used, the GEBCO grid gets reused in Google Earth as ocean maps, as well as just as the GEBCO grid itself, and it gets delivered out through all these different platforms and web service and things like that. So we know it gets used a lot. So we can go to like the NCEI data portals, and a lot of these web services actually show usage and downloads of the data. And then it gets a little complicated if you wanted to figure out by year, because frequently it's the same site and they'll just push the updated grid to it. So that's a little bit trickier question. But the GEBCO grid gets looked at millions and millions of times. And if you look at something like, it uses a base map for all sorts of purposes. So, yay, it gets used. I thought that was like really cool. So, and if your data goes in there, millions of people will look at it. They might not look it up super close, but they will look at it. They will see it. What are people using it for? You guys have heard a little bit about previous seminars about like ocean dynamical models and things like that. So you really need these continuous grids in order to run the global scale models of the oceans and atmospheres. That's the same thing for small scale. So anything from tsunamis, ocean currents, sediment transport, storm inundation, waves, propagation, all that great stuff, you need continuous bathymetry. Then we get into things like habitat, volcanism, marine geology, marine and spatial planning. Then you get things into more detailed geophysical studies of hazards and exploration for minerals, planning infrastructure, cable routing, all that stuff. So, and a lot of this data is then reshared via regional grids and data portals where even more people, you can track who used it, in what form, and their impacts. Hopefully now we all know what I'm talking about with this GEBCO grid and the importance of it. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about like what goes into our most recent updates and some of the new products coming out. So right now we're still in sort of developmental stage, but all the regional centers have now submitted example high resolution areas for their regions to show what a 100 meter, 200 meter, and a 400 meter grid would look like, and test trying to handle data at that resolution. It's a little bit tricky to just show that much data at that scale and then share it with people. Most people can't just download that because or the whole world at that size, right? So this is testing, and this is our test area is Hawaii. So you should be able to go down to the website for the Seabed 2030 and play with a version of that if you want to. We're trying to create a grid version of where our data sources come from. Sounds so simple, but this is where implementation of data management and all that stuff becomes trickier. Hopefully we'll have something that will at least help internally to show where things are more reliably by tracking within raster bands the identified number of what each data set is. Okay, so what went to the 2025 grid? And what are some of these issues we've had? So here's my little honeycomb pattern to describe all these little pieces that make this happen, right? All these collaborations, all these separate little issues that are related to us getting data and getting into this grid, right? We've got like sharing knowledge, sharing workflows with each other, having standards, probably getting this concept that we can use data many times for different purposes. How do we share what's mapped versus unmapped? Training, crowdsourced bathymetry, softwares and tools, data assessment, discovery, web services to help us discover data, bathymetry, what is bathymetry, how can we get it? All this great stuff, transit mapping, right? So I want to talk a little bit more about some of those things later, but right now I'm going to kind of talk more about like our kind of data ingestion pipeline and things that directly affect that. And then this is my like simplified little diagram of like, we get data, we get beautiful data, it all looks lovely, it's already been cleaned and processed, we get metadata, it looks lovely, and it should go in here, whoops. We should be able to just convert it and ingest it. And that like never happens that easily. It's always way more complicated. So this is why we need like mini projects and to talk about breaking these up into much more substantial effort. So I'm going to talk about this kind of mini data wrangling projects. That each of these larger data sets is actually a substantial amount of work to bring them into the grid. And some of the general workflow processes we're working on. So as part of this, I'll just mention some of the big data sets we had in 2025 grid. So 28 deep water surveys. We got 58 surveys from NOAA, Office Cook Survey. A lot of data was collected in Alaska, which is fantastic because that area has a lot of places that have not been mapped to modern standards. We also get a lot of data from the Nautilus and Ocean Exploration Trust. The Okeanos Explorer is wonderful because they provide lovely clean grids that we can put in lots of parts of the deep ocean in the Pacific right now. And then I separated out some of these other cruises we got that were cleaned from other sources. Most of our data that we kind of concentrate on cleaning here is usually data that's come through the US academic fleet, the UNH fleet. And these are just some of the ships that we worked on and brought into the grid really this past year. It was a little more complicated for the 2023 grid. I just wanted to highlight some of the other large data providers we brought in. So like USGS, they do ocean mapping. Inkfish, they provided a lot of data for us. Again, the Nautilus, the SOM, which is a French ship, and on this map you can see JAMSTEC data. So another data set we brought in that took a bit of time to get in. You wouldn't think, because it's a continuous grid, that it would be that hard, but it's a little bit tricky. As we brought in NOAA fisheries dry bathymetric maps. So Mark Zimmerman and his colleagues in NOAA fisheries has spent a lot of time generating maps for Alaska. And they brought in the NOAA sounding data. They went and took the scanned in sheets of data that's really old, whether it's lead line or sonar data from like the 1930s, 40s, early 80s, 50s, whatever it is, digitized that and brought that in to make maps. In addition to trying to find any existing multibeam and more modern data. But these created really nice grids for the area. So just wanted to highlight those. All right, and so some other cool data sets we brought in was continuous grids for the Northwest Hawaiian Islands from the University of Hawaii. JAMSTEC data, Japan's research fleet. Michael Bagako spent a lot of time trying to bring in single beam data. So that was we brought in only the modern GPS era where it would be higher navigational precision for the deep ocean. We now have some satellite-derived bathymetry thanks to the Green Water Foundation, which decargo processes. And then just a little zoom in as to what some of these surveys look like that we processed this past year. So in order to bring this all in, and one of the reasons why this takes a little bit of time to make this happen is we need metadata that's sufficient to look at things. And now I'm going to talk a little bit on how do we find data. And so get this data to come in. So Chiaki Okado, as part of her lab visit, she helped us bring in JAMSTEC data, helped us talk directly to the scientists at JAMSTEC to make sure we were getting the data correctly, figure out where it is, understanding their archive system. That was very, very helpful. Small project, but very, very helpful. But again, understanding metadata and what's going on, we have to know that in order to bring things in. So some other small projects were Dana from Kenya. She did her project on USGS data, bringing that in from Alaska. Ahmed, he did some work looking at the Canadian data, see if we already had it all. This is actually a pain in the butt, to see if it's the exact same survey because they give different survey numbers to the exact same data that will be held in the NCEI archive. So again, different metadata telling us the same thing, but it's not consistently identifying the same way. So, and so I've kind of put this here. So Hamina, she did something a little bit different. She spent several months with us working on the North Pacific data center stuff, but also wearing another hat with her job that she just started earlier this year down in Panama with the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute and the Charles Darwin Foundation. I think Galapagos Islands in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, new initiative there. So, well, you get to learn a lot about how to find data and all this work we do to try and figure out what data is where, which is way more complicated than it should be. And she also got to use some of the tools this lab have created. I just wanted to highlight this example of collaboration and sharing knowledge and how to do things. So Hemina was able to create this really gorgeous grid for the Eastern Tropical Pacific thanks to her being able to spend time and learn how to do this well here. So hopefully Hemina's online. And so this is part of this new Deep Ocean Alliance down there. And so their goal is to try and find these critical deep sea habitats, where you might have the deep ocean corals and things like that. They were really interested in that biodiversity in the deep ocean and figuring out where those places are and where do they need to map to find more of those places. So, and Hemina was able to put this into the gap filler tool to try and calculate places that we need to be mapped and things like that. So, bring us back to all these things we should be working on. I just mentioned gap filler, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the CCOM tools. And there are a whole bunch of sites that you guys should explore if you are interested in those tools. But gap filler, there are two versions. There is the gap filler desktop version, which was written by Colin Ware. And Hemina worked with Paul and was able to incorporate in her own version of the bathymetry to run the metrics on this. Normally people don't do that. You usually wait for the grid to get updated and put in the CCOM website. But there is now a new beta version, and this is something that the VisLab folks have been working on. Ilya and the new PhD student Devin Thomas have been working really hard on that. So if you want to go and play with that, I highly encourage you to go play with that tool and see how it works. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit on these challenges of, I've been saying, metadata is a pain in the butt. Why aren't things coordinated? I'm not the only one saying that. There are kind of three issues that kind of the folks in the Seabed 2030 community of GEBCO and broader ocean mapping have been worried about. How are we going to map more and fill in the gaps with transit mapping? Can we share this data better? How do we do that? And then once we've mapped and cleaned the data, can we share that better? So somebody doesn't have to clean the same data set all over again. Not specifically North Pacific data center, but the GEBCO technical strategic plan has identified these three key areas: transit mapping, metadata, and improved web services, and GSF format or any generic format we can save our data to and share and archive them. So there's actually some headway on this GSF format. Lindsay G and Daniel Neville from Spatial Analytics have actually put a lot of work into a really cool tool. Danny has done all this coding to create this community toolkit. So if you guys are interested in that kind of thing, it's supposed to basically get around some of the problems of the GSF and make a toolbox that kind of handles all these different weird versions, which is, if you've ever worked with GSF, is one of the biggest problems with GSF, is that you end up with like 25 zillion different versions and then writing a code for everyone to write code to try and handle 25 zillion different versions is really, really hard. So kudos to them for like making that work. So it is supposed to come out soon have a home on the ocean mapping wiki. So if you want to go and play with that, keep your eyes out for that one. So what about these web services and metadata? So what's cool is that there aren't that many big, large data servers of these metadata and ocean data out there. So most of the big ones have got together now and started to talk about like how they can get some of these essential pieces of information to be identical and use the same kinds of services, so people can you can load them up and maybe write a script that will let you join them together and query things, right? Some of them aren't even queryable, it's just a picture. So progress is being made. It's slow, but it's happening. And then unifying metadata was also part of that ongoing discussion. So the other thing is there's a transit mapping document that's in draft mode right now, just so people know, have something to refer to about transit mapping and what it is, why you want to do it, all that good stuff. All these topics you could write forever about and improve a lot, but basic starting point. Global collaborations and talking to each other. All right, so some of the other things we've been working on to try and make all this processing massive amounts of data better is we've been trying to work a little bit on improving our internal workflows. So Fahima this summer spent time working with both Val's group and us on trying to automate a workflow in Chimera to make, hopefully speed things up a little bit. And then we played around with filters some. So transit data is like nobody really spends time on filtering transit data because all the software companies are interested in selling filtering and playing with filtering for nice little survey areas. So it's kind of in this space. So they're known tools, but I set some people onto testing some things out. So Emma got tasked with the really ugly Healy data. I don't know. The Healy is an icebreaker. Icebreakers are notorious for having very horrible data when they are going through ice. So I led her in the direction of trying some different filters for different types of noise in different places to see if she could recover any of the data that looked really gnarly. That was like her little project. She did get through some nice clean data from the Healy, which was awesome. But there was some data in places where there was no data from anybody. So that was why we were trying to spend a little more time on that one. And then we had JJ tried to run some basic filters on some transit data. We had them clean manually, and then just, hey, can you run things through and see if it does anything useful at all? I'll have to see if this is repeatable or continues to be useful in the toolbox. And this is just a little diagram of PMS hard work on trying to make automation in Chimera. So for Seabed 2030, for archive data, we don't really want to run things in a loop, but for Val's purposes, checking a little folder to see if there's any new data is important. So that's to collecting new data's aims, which is an important part of Seabed 2030, getting us new data. But for going through the archive, being able to point to folders and say, let's shove this all in here and can we get the grid out and like look at it. In the past, less of a priority because NCEI was going through and making us lovely maps showing what the raw data looked like, and we could just go and look at that. But they've been so backed up that they've been shoving stuff onto the servers, so we have to look for, and then we don't really know what it looks like, so we have to actually plot it. And so if we're going to plot it, we might as well put it into Chimera and process it in there and do all that stuff in a more automated fashion and see how that works. One of the really good things about this automation step is us being able to export out our GSFs so we can send them to the GMRT team at Mount Doherty, where they can archive them and use them in their products so they don't have to clean the exact same data sets again. So that is a big deal. And it works way better if it's running not in the GUI in Chimera. It takes a long time to export that stuff out. That was just a few of the things. You could have 5 million talks about any of these topics. But some of the things we've talked about and worked with people in the past year on is there's interested in mapping the gaps in ocean mapping. The Marine Technological Society Journal had a special issue that came out in the spring. Technically it was August, like it came live, but it's dedicated to ocean mapping and figuring out how to fill the gaps in ocean mapping. I worked with Fahima on making an article targeted at bridging the gaps mapping data in Algeria and talking about why ocean mapping is important and pointing to things like standards that already exist and why those are important for data reuse and how you have conversations about protecting your resources, things like archaeological treasures. So I reached out to some colleagues in Algeria that do archaeology, really cool stuff, underwater mapping, and are very interested in having those higher resolution maps Algeria is full of really cool old archaeology, so, and a lot of it's underwater in the maritime. Exciting. And then we've got a lot of previous alumni of the program here that have done a lot of great stuff, taking advantage of programs around the world and bringing technology and resources to smaller countries in the South Pacific to start mapping there. So making sure that you know that, hey, Okeanos is coming through, hey, the Nautilus is coming through, and connecting those people to the locals and bringing the knowledge together. So there are resources out there, so try to outline what those are so people can look at them and say, hey, I want to do this in my country or this region. How do we build on what other people have done? So that's our best practices. And then other things we're kind of passionate about here is sort of training and the importance of this networks, and we got all these people in this room that are here to hopefully get training and build networks. There actually aren't that many places to go and look to see where do you do that. So this whole poll will be opened up to have people try to list where are training programs. Where did you get your education? What are you interested in? Do you want to go to sea? Some people don't want to go to sea. People don't want anything to go to sea. But if you do, and that's a necessary part of the job, how do you even get that training? So that's part of this whole conversation of how we map the oceans and get data to then fill in our grid. So there are lots and lots and lots and lots of people and lots of organizations around the world, but that we rely on to collaborate together, and we build on their research and all the different little pieces they are doing. And if we can talk to each other and we collaborate and we make similar metadata and we agree on outputs, suddenly this effort becomes a lot more efficient. So just mention some of the groups who are in the mapping community, and then I thought I'd give you guys some pretty pictures. All right, that's it.
Kim, go ahead.
You talked a lot about like the process flow of the data when you get it.
Yeah.
But there really was not any conversation about tracking the uncertainty or just tracking quality and getting to a point where you would say, yes, this is good enough, we have enough of the metadata, we don't. Could you just talk about sort of the quality flags that you use?
Yeah, I started to make another talk that was that, and I was like, I'm going to bore everyone in this room. Yeah, so that's actually, that's a really big deal. In some places there is no data, so what is decent enough to be replace satellite derived data, right? That's a like first level quality assessment of like how bad you have to be really bad about that. But there are data sets that are really, really horrible and like figuring things out. So like Michael working with a single beam, for instance, that's a lot trickier to clean and assess when you're looking at an archive that just has X, Y, Z, essentially. Because doesn't come with some of those other metrics. And you've got a single line you've got a line that's continuous, but you're not really having that joy of having all the multi-beam. You get this big wide swath of data and you can like average it across and you can see patterns and things look like really funky. That's obviously like a big flyer really easily. That process is much easier when you have that multi-beam data or a LiDAR data that's got that wide swath. So that's one example of where like some data sets are way easier to assess what is really screwy. Like a zero of the ocean surface versus 5,000 meters. That's a little bit easier to assess and put a bound on, say, this is more than 10% standard deviation that we might call suspicious. It's kind of commonly used in hydrography. yeah, so then we get into data sets that they look okay, right, versus super nice. And so then we do go through and rank data sets internally, and say, give an assessment score for really high quality looking data versus meh. Still good enough to probably beat out was no data, but we want to make sure that the really good data goes on top of it. And the type of sensor does factor into that, so gets a separate ranking from Multibeam should beat out the satellite direct bathymetry, for instance.
Right, thank you.
Long?
Yeah, thanks for that overview, appreciate that. So for the 2030 project, what is their spatial resolution goal? And what are they trying to get down to? You could say it's mapped now with 100-kilometer resolution. What resolution do they want to get down to?
So there are depth bands, so the global grid right now is published at 15 arc seconds, which is close to 400 meters. So that multi-resolution product I mentioned is 400 meters, 200 meters, and 100 meters, because those are like the bands for is it mapped. So it's like, we're not gonna map the deep ocean at 100 meters, that's not the goal. If it's 4,000 meters deep, that's not the resolution that we're getting from a sonar. So there are depth bands for 2,500 meters, like 4,000 meters, is it 8,000 meters deep? Those are gonna constrain whether that makes sense for 100 meter versus 250 meter versus 400 meter. Granted, the whole ocean at 400 meters. You just need one sounding in that 400 meters for us to call it mapped.
And 27% of the Earth
We've got at least
ocean basins
one,
is mapped with at least one
Yeah.
point within a 400-meter spatial resolution.
I'm gonna call it like, it's like 20, I don't remember off the top of my head. It's like 23% or 24%, somewhere in there is now multi-beam. I mean, like 23 point something percent for the ocean. So that's for multi-beam is pretty good.
And so obviously on the shelf and other places of high importance, those numbers are gonna get tighter.
Yeah, so a lot of countries then have their own goals for what is considered mapped that allow the sort of higher resolution factors to come in for the shelf. Right? 'Cause that's
Movie?
Yeah, you talked about the difficulty in putting together the map of Alaska, I believe. Could you explain a little bit of like the workflow that goes into putting that into the database, that information?
so yeah, we have to get, well, we get data, right?
Right.
So for assuming we've gotten a processed and clean data set.
Yeah.
So some of what we do is the processing. So we say it looks beautiful, we know what it's, we have to know what datum it's in, we need to know like projection it's in, all that basic GIS, geospatial information. So one of the things we try to do is we try to make sure we can get that technique of sounding, type of sounding that was used, sounding technique that was used, separated out. So if we get a grid that where somebody's interpolated, but they also have real data, we try to work with them to get that information and then separate things out. One of the issues with Alaska was the data we were given was on a different projection. And then if you go to try and reproject that, oh, such funky things happen. We also have the issue of the international date line, which a lot of modern GIS software was written by people and not in the middle of the Pacific. And since that's the breakpoint the software, I see some people, we've got multiple people from the Pacific this year that are probably very familiar with this issue. A lot of the software does not handle that very well because the solution to like for geographic coordinates handling a sphere is they break it, right? And if you're gonna map mathematically should not be that difficult, but somehow there are always bugs in the code and it likes to break there. So like those are two issues that cause problems, so that we've had to actually like export the grid to points and then regrid. Thankfully it was at a high enough resolution that made that a little bit easier, but there's all sorts of funky things happen with projection, so and that's just a basic level thing. We're not like doing crazy stuff with it, just trying to handle the projections. Is it high enough latitude that we are get major distortion.
Any more questions? No. Okay, I think I have one before we.
We have two comments online
Okay.
from Guy Knoll. First one is old H-sheets surveys were digitized by Mark Zimmerman at NMFS to get better geomorphology for benethic habitat, pollock and or hyperpalid, etc. This was about 20 minutes ago. And then more recently, I think it's ironic that the older, often sextant position digitized H surveys from NMFS are used in Alaska, but not the H survey data pre-GPS in the 80s and 90s.
That's a long process to get the data in, so that's basically the response to that. So each data set takes a long time to get in, so if they're not in, I know the National Bathymetric Source has been going through some of the older data, particularly in Alaska. So some things are coming back through with a check, and so we've been trying to collaborate and pay attention to what folks in NOAA are doing, so we do not repeat the same work. So, but yes, there is a lot of 90s data that is pretty high quality, that is in Alaska in some areas. That's not in our map yet.
Yeah, so yeah, like to my question, you kind of mentioned about like, creating multi-band, like so not just, you don't have the bathymetry alone, you want to have the source and maybe the uncertainty layer, you don't quite say what the third layer, but I'm guessing it should be uncertainty layer. And this will kind of take me back to Kip's question where he was kind of asking about the quality metrics. So eventually is there a plan to kind of have like a layer for the uncertainty, just like what the MBS team are kind of like having, and so that
I would love to do that. This comes to what some things we've been playing with is that like it's actually, we can't just like right now, we can't just run like Chimera and then re-export out uncertainty in a bulk script. It won't let us do that. So like you would have had to do another step. So it's actually not a simple thing the idea sounds very simple. Doing it is actually way harder to do.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's why I'm asking the question, and because like for the bathymetry, it's probably like easier, but when you have other data sources, like kind of like combining like uncertainty from those other like I imagine that might be. So it's not.
It's
like,
not
it's
easy.
not there. Yeah. So is there?
It's
do you
not
have,
simple
do you have
to do
any
it.
plans like kind of like to do that, or maybe at some point? Or
If you went and looked at the board next to Fahima's desk, and there you can see us scribbling about like how to calculate uncertainty and how we would do it. But it's a lot harder to do that. We would love to do that, but we get some tickets of Chimera.
yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's thank our speaker.